Valley of Sorek, year 1070 BC. A hot, damp night smelling of old dust and rancid oil burning in a nearly dead lamp. A night that didn't make it into the scrolls of kings, but that still echoes in the memory of those who saw a giant fall without a sword being raised. His name was Samson, a judge of Israel, a man who owed no explanations to anyone, not to kings, not to beasts. His strength did not come from muscles, but from a vow made in his belly. And anyone who saw that man tear a lion apart as easily as tearing cloth knows he was no ordinary man. I was just a servant, someone who swept the floor of Delilah's house and pretended not to hear what I should have denounced. She wasn't a soldier, nor a sorceress, nor a princess. She was just a woman with eyes that could read the cracks in any man's soul, and that was worse than any Philistine blade. That night her mission was simple, to uncover the secret that not even the army could extract. They gave her the prize, the promise, and the silence, and she obeyed. She smiled, she caressed, she asked questions. And when Samson, too tired to continue being a miracle, laid his head in her lap, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Each strand of that hair carried a pact. Each of her touches concealed a betrayal. And when the first strand fell to the ground, it wasn't just his hair that was cut. It was the boundary between man and destiny. This is the story of the man who broke down gates, tore through beasts, and faced armies, but could not conquer his own heart. But before I tell you how this story ends, comment below. Where are you watching from and what time is it there now? And subscribe to the channel, because the truth I'm about to reveal to you today doesn't fit into sermons. And they say a man's footsteps reveal who he is long before his face enters the room. Samson's arrived like distant thunder, slow, heavy, carrying the promise of something you can't outrun. I was sweeping the corner of Delilah's house that night, pretending not to hear the murmurs outside, the Philistine lords whispering their schemes in the alley like rats waiting for scraps. The air smelled of hot oil, crushed dates, and that sweet perfume Delilah wore when she wanted to turn a man's judgment soft. Even the lamps flickered lower, as if uneasy about what was coming. Then he stepped inside. You don't understand Samson until you stand near him. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls too close, like the house itself was holding its breath. His shoulders nearly brushed the doorframe. Dust clung to his skin, as if even the road refused to let go. And his eyes, God help me, carried the restless fire of a man who has fought too many battles, inside and out. Gaza feared him. Women whispered about him. Men cursed his name through clenched teeth. But in that moment, all I saw was a storm, trying to remember why it should stay angry. Delilah walked toward him with the softness of a cat crossing a quiet room, every gesture measured, every breath rehearsed. She smiled as though she had waited her whole life for that moment, and maybe she had, not for him, but for what bringing him down would earn her. Her hands brushed his arm as she led him inside, and I swear I saw Samson's defenses drop, not because she bewitched him, but because he wanted to believe someone in this cursed world could love a man like him. He laughed, low, tired, almost embarrassed, as if trying to hide how much he needed that touch. That laugh unsettled me more than any roar I imagined he had let out on a battlefield. Strength is easy to see. Weakness, that's the part people bleed over. I kept my eyes down, pretending to be invisible, but I watched everything through the reflection of a brass bowl I held. Delilah's fingers traced the lines of Samson's hands, the same hands that had torn a lion apart. And the way he looked at her, trusting, open, made my stomach twist. He didn't walk into a trap. He walked into a promise he desperately wanted to be true. Outside, the Philistine lords whispered again. Inside, Delilah murmured Samson's name with practiced sweetness, and I sensed something shift in the air, something fragile and dangerous. A giant had entered the house, but only a man took a seat on her cushion, and I knew, in that quiet, suffocating first night, something in him had already begun to fall. Samson's stories came out of him like smoke from a fire, unplanned, warm, and carrying embers. He spoke of the lion not as a feat to boast about, but as a memory that still had teeth. It smelled of figs and morning, he said once, tracing with a thumb the seam of the cushion, as if he could press the moment back into flesh. Delilah listened with a patience that was almost surgical, folding each detail into her knotted, careful silence. I kept my hands busy with the bread tray so she wouldn't see my eyes snag on him. He would lift his chin and smile like a man surprised by his own past. It came at me out of the north bush, he told her, the voice the same one men used when they tried to explain things they themselves did not understand. To us, the servants, those moments were like watching a sleeping beast dream. His fingers flexed, his jaw tightened, and for an instant the room filled with a memory of claws and rope and the raw smell of iron. He was not speaking to impress Delilah. He was confessing to her without admitting the shame of needing to confess. Delilah would lean in, not to question the facts, but to be near the man who had such stories. She would tuck a stray curl behind his ear with a touch that was practice and politics both. Sometimes she laughed, small and quick, at the wrong parts. Those laughs that mean less than the silence that follows. I began to see patterns in her listening, a pause where others would answer, a look aimed not at Samson but at the space behind him, checking whether eyes watched from the shadows. There were nights he would talk of fire, fields set alight like the hands of God, sweeping away the chaff, and those words tightened something behind my ribs. He had a way of making violence sound like an old wound, something that had grown into him. He revealed nothing of strategy. His confessions were human, threaded with the ache of a man who had given himself to feats because he did not know how to give himself to steadiness. When he spoke of lovers and insults, of the Philistine taunts, I saw how the stories were a second skin. He did not tell them to frighten, he told them to be seen. Maybe that was why he came to Delilah, to have his legend held, to have it stroked and made small so he could be ordinary, even if only for the span of a night. Later, I would understand that those memories were the slow loosening of his armor. Now I only noticed how he relaxed into recollection, and how Delilah's fingers moved closer each time, as if mapping a route she planned to follow. Outside, the alleyways waited like coiled ropes. Inside, the lion's memory made the house smell of ash and salt. I did not realize then that every time he told the tale, he gave Delilah another thread to pull. Delilah's questions arrived like small knives, polished and ordinary. She began with teasing ones. "Tell me a secret," she'd say, half smiling, but they were not innocent. She wrapped them in affection so they cut gentler, and Samson, blinded by the wanting of warmth, handed her answers like a man tossing bread to a beggar. The Philistine lords, I learned afterward, were never far. They lingered in the smoke and shadows, waiting for their chance to collect. At first, Samson misled her with the casual arrogance of a strong man used to being misunderstood. He spoke of ropes, and Delilah laughed and pretended to be crafty. "Tie him with 7 fresh bowstrings," they whispered from the alley once, and he, certain in his mythic invulnerability, offered a theatrical shrug. He gamely allowed himself to be bound, snarling and tearing each string, as if demonstrating the uselessness of their cunning. We cheered him on, fools, all of us, because he was our thunder, and we wanted the storm to stay. Delilah's smile did not change. She watched his triumphs with the same quiet attention she paid his silences, and when the bowstrings parted, she only blinked as if someone showing a trick had yet to perform the reveal. The Philistines cursed and retreated into their corners, but their eyes remained like pins stuck in the dark. On another night they tried new devices. Men came with woven bands and new knots. Each time he broke them, Samson still looked at Delilah as if hope lay in her hands. He loved the theater of it, breaking the ropes, proving himself, but he loved more than the performance the fact that someone had asked. That small act of being desired was softening him from within. He told small lies too. "It's the strength of my hair," he said once, joking as if hair could be the only thing between a man and the world. He confessed minor falsities about where he'd come from, who he had wronged, as if smoothing edges so the world could grip him without splintering. Each slip of truth he withheld was a recess where someone like Delilah could sneak a lighted candle. I watched Delilah pretend to be puzzled, pretend to press him for meaning, and every time I felt a prickle on my neck. She would coax and then recoil, feigning disappointment, lowering her voice until it was the hush of someone telling a child not to play near the fire. And Samson, wanting to keep her close, kept playing along, offering bits of himself, confident that the rest could stay hidden. None of us suspected the depth of her patience. She asked the questions of a woman who had counted coins and scars in equal measure, who knew how to make men give up what they believed they could keep. The night she finally demanded truth, the house held its breath as if bracing for a storm that would not make noise. Outside, the Philistine watchman shifted. Inside, Delilah pressed closer and said, with false weakness, "If you loved me, would you not tell me your secret?" His answer, when it came, was softer than the question, and I sensed the trap had teeth we could not see yet. It happened slowly, how a man's defenses give way, like a mountain sinking into a fog. You do not notice notice until the valley is full. That night I heard Samson's laughter thin, like a rope near its fray. Delilah insisted with a voice that could have been motherly or merciless, I couldn't tell which, and the house felt lined with glass. She began to make her pleas heavier, not with force but with the gravity of someone wounded and whispering for love. She accused him once, softly, of not loving her. The accusation was a sliver, and it found purchase. Samson's shoulders, which had carried the weight of battle, slouched for the first time before us. He faltered, fumbling for a jest, then stopped. "Do you not see," he said to her later, and the words sounded tired, "a man can fight armies and still lose to a cornered ache." The men in the alley pressed their faces to the cracks in the wall that night, but what shook the house was not the thought of their net, but the slow, intimate quarrel between two people who both wanted to be believed. Delilah's hands were heaven and tribunal. Her palms cupped his face with practiced tenderness, then tightened, as if cataloguing flaws. She accused him of living behind legend, and he answered with silence, like a flint struck too often. I watched him attempt to conjure stoicism, but his voice broke on things that had nothing to do with hair or strength. He spoke of fathers, of promises, of being used and applauded and then left alone. His monologue was not about tactics, it was confession. He told of nights after raids, when the only sound was his own breath, and how in those hours his whole body ached for a touch that would not ask for spectacle in return. Delilah listened, and then turned those confessions gently, as if curating relics. She wounded him not with swords, but with questions that named what he feared most: loneliness. She made herself a mirror that returned not strength, but the image of a boy who had been applauded into hardness. When he touched her hand in the dark, it was not merely desire, it was a reaching for something to steady him. After that night, I started to see the fissures. He began to come late and leave earlier, drawn always back to that dim room, as if to check whether the warmth that had roughed his edges remained. He joked less, he bragged less. The stories of lions and gates became shorter, and he lingered longer on the small human admissions. The trap the Philistines set had been patient, but it was Delilah's kindness, wielded with intent, that pried the first hinge. There is a brutality in gentleness when it is cunningly administered, and that night it cracked the hardest thing Samson owned, the belief that he could remain unowned. That night, when the house grew too quiet to hold the sound of a pin, Delilah did something I had not seen before. She slept with Samson's head on her lap. It should have been a tender image, and for a sliver of time it was. His breathing even, his face slack with an exhaustion that resembled peace. But peace is a fragile vase, and she had come to break it with hands that pretended to mend. Her fingers threaded through the crown of his hair, not as a lover but as an examiner. She mapped the cords and knots the way a surgeon maps veins. I watched from the shadowed doorway, the oil lamp guttering low, and felt something acutely wrong, like watching the tide come in over a child's sandcastle. Samson's trust then was less than naive. It was the last thing he owned freely, and he let her hold it because she had made him believe she would keep it safe. Delilah hummed a tune, small and almost tuneless, and the men outside shifted like sacks in the dark. I wanted to stand and throw them out, throw the Philistines out, throw Delilah out, but who does a servant become to a godlike man? I was invisible by oath and habit, and the only way to keep from screaming was to keep sweeping. She asked his secret again, quieter this time, not as a trap but as a plea. Samson mumbled, distracted by sleep or by the nearness. It was a voice of a man who had been worn down by wanting to be known. "If you really loved me," she said, "I would know. And if I knew—" Her sentence stopped, as if she had been interrupted by her own plotting. He stirred and muttered something about his strength being like a cord that was not cut. He spoke in images and vows: long hair, vow to God, Nazarite consecration. Words that sounded like old linens, fragile and holy. The way he spoke their edges made them seem private, like a secret kept between a man and the sky. Delilah's face softened, as if the words were a lullaby, and her fingers tightened in a way I would later never forget. She did not leap up then and run to show the lords. She waited. She waited like someone letting dough rise to the exact moment before it would crack. The secret sat between them, suspended and quivering, a thing waiting to be plucked like a string. And Samson, tired from a life that had required spectacle and solitude in equal measure, wanted to believe that someone desired the whole, not just the wonder. That night, the thread of the secret trembled. The house was full of the kind of silence that could either mend defend or kill. We thought perhaps that love would keep him. We were wrong. When a man finally gives a secret, it often comes as a tired surrender rather than a trumpet call confession. Samson told Delilah in a voice that had been thinned to breath. He spoke of a vow, the hair that had never known a razor, the consecration that bound him to a god whose presence was more like a memory than a garment. The words spilled out, not as explanations, but as the confession of a creature who had been exhausted by being extraordinary. Delilah's face did not change as the secret arrived. She had been prepared for the exact shape of it. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice remained even, the tone of someone who has practiced this scene until the lines are sewn into muscle. She listened as if she had been given a gospel she had always meant to read. When he stopped, she asked no follow-ups. There was no need. He had given her the map. Outside, men shifted into motion like shadows pulling taut. Inside, the house continued its quiet ritual. An oil lamp, a bowl, the soft scrape of a spoon. The ordinariness of the room made the treachery more obscene. I wanted to leap up and shout that the greatest thing between them was not hair, but an oath. But I was a servant. My voice had been rented long before. Delilah rose slowly, her movements smooth and inevitable. "I will keep this," she said, and the words were softer than mercy. She left the room by the side door, and Samson, whose heart had already been hollowed by his chain of fame and abandonment, slept like a man who believes the world cannot touch him now. That was the cruelest part, his sleep. They came with no clatter, as if the night itself moved them. Philistine hands, quick and cruel, took the razor they had hidden beneath cloaks. I heard the scrape of the blade as if it were an animal whispering its last oath. It is strange how sound can seem small and infinite at once. The single slide of metal along hair that had never known a cut, the faint brush that felt like the world's first death. She returned with her hands clean and her face mild, and when she knelt to Samson in the dim and parted the hair at his nape, I wanted to tear the cloth from my head and cry out. It was delicate, the razor's kiss, but its consequence was thunder. Each strand that fell was not merely hair, but the symbol of a vow, an unspooled covenant between a man and his God. The strands pooled like dark rain on the cushion. He woke to the light and to the felt absence of something that had been as much spirit as flesh. The first hour after betrayal is always a loneliness like a new wound. Samson rose and tried to call on his strength, but it thinned beneath him like smoke. He pushed, he strained, he cursed the ropes as if muscle alone could answer the treachery of a whispered truth given to the wrong ears. Outside, the Philistines closed in, the plan having a new and terrible certainty. Inside, Delilah watched with a face that held neither triumph nor disgust, a woman who had done what she needed to do to survive in the way the world had taught her. I had never seen a warrior die from a whisper before. It was not a dramatic fall. It was the slow unthreading of a man's center until nothing held him upright. I understood then that some betrayals are softer than swords and more absolute. He woke as if from a sleep that had been pretending to be peaceful and found himself suddenly small. The first thing he did was reach up for that familiar anchor. His hair and his fingers met emptiness. There is a certain animal panic when a creature reaches for a limb and finds nothing. Samson's roar when he tried to rise was guttural and raw, like a bell split by lightning. They bound him with ropes and dragged him into the street, where the Philistines revealed him as a prize they had worked to craft. I stood in the doorway, my palms slick with flour and my heart a stone. He was no spectacle then, only a man whose breath came sharp and quick. His eyes searched, bewildered. Where once there had been a confidence like a shield, now there was something like grief. They mocked him, sure, but the mockery was thin. The city that had trembled at his name now jeered at the husk of the man whose feats had once made them bend. They gouged him not with words alone. They went further, and I watched through a veil of tears as hands meant for battle practiced cruelty. Stone and metal and laughter met him, and each blow seemed intended not merely to injure, but to erase. They took him to Gaza first. Parade, show, humiliation where power was measured in spectacle rather than truth. People spat, soldiers prodded, children shrieked. They hung him in chains and jeered, while the men who had wanted him captured set their cruel music in motion. The worst was not the rope or the jeer. It was seeing a man reduced to an object by the very people whose bread he had once scattered with his rage. They gouged his eyes afterward, and I cannot find words that carry the salt of that moment. There is an intimate darkness in losing sight that is not merely absence, but a tearing away of memory. Samson Samson howled in a way that was not of a man but of some wounded animal that had loved a battle trumpet and now only heard hollow wind. Yet in that dark, something stubborn remained. Even blind, he clung to the center of himself in ways most of us would not expect. He reached with hands that could no longer find hair, but could find the grooves of the world he had known. They chained him to a mill, and there he worked, turning grain for the lords who had crowned him as a fool. Each rotation of that heavy stone felt like a meter counting down something else. I would watch him many times in that mill room, his body beaten, his face an empty map, but sometimes he would hum. It was not a tune of defeat. It was a small, ragged hymn that suggested memory, or perhaps a beginning of repentance. I do not know which. The Philistines, satisfied with spectacle, grew careless in their watching. They let us believe the man we had adored was finally gone. But grief has no expiration. It builds like a storm that rolls and rolls until the sky can no longer keep it. Samson's silence began to thicken into something I would later recognize as prayer. Blind, bowed, he remembered things only a sighted heart could see. Names, voices, promises. His hands found the grooves of the mill as if feeling for secret geography. In the small space of that grinding room, I saw a man inventing an inner sight that the Philistines could not touch. They led him to the great temple. Our story calls it a house of false gods, but he walked like a man with a single ember burning inside a cavern. Small, dangerous, patient. The Philistines wanted a spectacle. They wanted to humiliate the man who had once been their nightmare. The great hall filled with people hungry for entertainment and vengeance, meat pressed to bone in the press of breath and shouting. They prodded Samson to stand between pillars and made him the center of a mockery masked as triumph. I stood where I could, hidden among crates and near the back where a servant might be mistaken for a lump of forgotten cloth. I had watched him as a thunderhead and as a mill slave, but this was the sharpest geometry of humiliation. The ropes, the laughter, the wine-fed bellies eager for spectacle. They bound his hands to the pillars, the cords biting into skin that had once carried walls and gates. He stood between the pillars, invisible to the crowd that only saw a beast to be tamed. I saw him close his eyes, or perhaps the Philistines had closed them earlier, and what followed was not the frantic thrashing of a madman, but the pulling inward of a man like a tide drawing itself into focus. Samson's chest heaved once, deeply, like a bellows calling for flame. His hands found the pillars not to push away, but to feel the weight he might bear. I will not lie. My heart wanted him to rise and tear the house down for pride, for the vengeance of men who had been wronged. And for a sliver of time, he seemed small enough, empty enough to be used. But when he prayed, one of the simple, crooked prayers of a man who had been loved and hurt and broken, there was a sound that touched something in me, like a bell blown from the inside. He asked for strength, not for vainglory, but for one last act to set the record straight. The pillars had been his enemies and would become his instruments. He drew himself up, a body that should have no power, and pushed with hands that trembled with both memory and faith. The first groan of timber and stone was like a cry from the earth. Then wood splintered and ropes snapped, and the hall turned to the language of falling things. The temple collapsed in a thunder that swallowed shouts and laughter. There was dust, so much dust it felt like night made of sand, and beneath it a chaos of limbs and voices. The Philistines cried out as the world rearranged. When the dust settled, the victory tasted like ruin. Samson lay in the ruin, blood and sweat mixing, and for the first time in years I heard a groan that was not a beast's but a man's, deep, human, and full of a farewell that felt also like a redemption. He died there, yes, in that hail of broken wood and stone, but not simply as a man crushed by weight. He died as someone who had gathered what was left of his honor and his faith and used it to pull down the house that had demanded spectacle over truth. In those final breaths, he was not the naive lover who had let a whisper steal him. He was the judge who, in the last act, judged the idolaters and himself. Afterward, we buried him hurriedly, in the way the living hide from the stench of death. People whispered about justice, ruin, God's hand. I held the fold of his cloak for a while and felt the coarseness of it. The man who had been thunder was also flesh, with the same ragged edges as any of us. When I left the grave, the city still hummed in the small, guilty way of people who have seen a giant fall and felt their own smallness return. I walked past Delilah's house, and the scent of her perfumes was gone, replaced by a concrete quiet. The world world went on, bending toward commerce and spite, but something in me shifted like a stone, settling in water. I had watched a man who tore lions and toppled gates be undone by a whisper, and then rise in the end to pull down a house of idols. It is a strange justice, and perhaps the only kind that could redeem him. I do not tell this as a sermon. I tell it because I stood in the room, and because the image of a great man kneeling between pillars and asking God for one last push will live in me until the dust of this world settles.